Can everyone see?
We can.
Okay. I'm going to shrink this picture down because it's right on top of the screen here. All right. So first of all, my topic is flourishing and languishing, effective organizational change and leadership in churches across the United States. I just want to take some time to thank my committee, Dr. Daring, first of all, for talking me into doing this and also helping me see something in myself I didn't see. And thanks, Dr. Kim, for walking along this journey with me, helping me become a better scholar and also a better researcher. I appreciate that. And Dr. Wilson for spending the 30 years through the good and bad of most of the things I've gone through in life as well. So I appreciate all the support. So the problem I'm trying to solve is the church is a great institution with thousands of years of history. Its unchanging foundation on the world means that it's a little bit hesitant because of God's word being the foundation of its existence. And so often it's resistant to change. And while the message of the gospel should never change, the structures need to adapt to the situations that are going on in the world around it. With that in mind, there is 6 in 10 Protestant churches that plateau or declining in attendance before COVID hit. Since then, the average age of 35 and younger had the steepest decline in those who were attending churches, leading to the highest drop in attendance rate of all the other age groups. Because of the present generation is comfortable with digital online worship, churches need to figure out how they will navigate a post-pandemic digitalized world. Kotter's model might be the practical way to help the church ease those tensions and move from languishing into flourishing. The purpose of the research is twofold. Number one, to identify factors that impact the church's ability to effectively change the culture, because that's what change is, a change in culture, and to analyze if Kotter's organizational change model is a viable model for Christian churches. So the primary research question was, how do congregations implement and experience change? And the expectation was that churches are going to do less time in the preparation phase and more time in the implementation phase. Then we asked sub-question 2 was, what barriers do congregations face during the change process? Looking at some of the research, they will struggle to adapt quickly, and sometimes their polity and their structures will hinder the process of change. What actions and behaviors do successful congregations implement during the change process? The things that churches do well was they learn to navigate the theories that they have and been given and adapt those to their individual situations. And the third research question was, what characteristics do successful congregations share that distinguish them from comparable congregations that are languishing? We looked at emphasis on emphasizing the sense of urgency in the beginning and also casting a vision that moves people. And for the church, the vision is always based on what is God's purpose for the church. I think it'd be helpful for me to kind of define some of the key definitions in this research. One of the terms we looked at really throughout the research project is the term missional. And that states that God and the church are intrinsically and principally missionary. God sends the church as a missionary institution. And then the term vision. Robert defines it as, what does God want us to do? And says that its vision is a distance between the reality of what is and the possibility of what could be. Through this research, we studied several different leadership styles: authentic, skill-based, authoritative, transactional, narcissistic, transformational, and servant. I picked 5 to put in the survey because those are the ones I felt were most prevalent in the church. The term charismatic really was narcissistic, but I thought that was probably one that no one's going to check off as one of their options. So I changed it to charismatic. And the definitions you see on the screen are the ones that were actually used to define those leadership styles in the survey. This is the theoretical framework I use, which is Kotter's model, kind of a quick review of it. The first phase is create a sense of urgency, form a guiding coalition, create strategic vision, communicate the vision, remove obstacles, generate short-term wins, make the change, and make the change stick. I took that and tried to put that into a Christian context for what the church would be. So number one, urgency, I changed it to a holy discontent, which is really where that place where the church realized that there needs to be a change and God is the one moving and orchestrating what the change should be. I also changed too a little bit to make it more of a diverse coalition, which is really important in a church setting, that you have multiple voices and multiple gifts being used in the process of the change team. And we changed vision to define your trophy because it's something I think people can resonate with in the church. We call stage 2 the build momentum stage, where you enlist volunteers, communicate the vision, you remove barriers, identify and overcome the barriers to change. Then we changed the other stage to call it producing the fruit stage, where you're actually seeing the benefits of what's going on in the process. And that is establishing, where you talk about short-term wins, celebrating wins, and also sharing stories in stage 6. And in stage 7 is make the change, where you're starting to build momentum to where you actually get to the flourishing stage. And the final stage we describe as the flourishing stage. The methodology used was, we had qualitative data collection, qualitative data analysis, we had quantitative data analysis, and qualitative data collection analysis. And then we integrated the qual and quam together and reported those findings in chapter 4. The instrumentation used was a Likert style survey, mixed method survey, which was called Methods and Behaviors to Lead Change at Christian Churches. It was based on Kotter's 8 steps. The survey had 16 Likert style questions and 17 open-ended questions in that survey. Phase 2 of that was the researcher, then myself, went and interviewed 2 pastors and got their kind of verified whether the information we're getting from the Likert style survey played out also into their congregation as well. So the sample size was heavily pastors, but we had pretty good mixture of non-pastors. That include teachers, lay people, church elected officials. It was heavily LCMS, 172 to 137 non-Lutherans, non-LCMS. It was heavily skewed toward those over 46 years of age. It was heavily white and heavily male dominated, the survey was, sample size. So these were the types of leadership styles and the percentages that came out. So the number one leadership style that was selected was servant leader at 31%, followed by transformational, then charismatic, then authoritative, and then finally skill-based. We broke down the stages of Kotter and kind of quantified those by how they ranked in the Likert style survey. And so you see those numbers there. And you can see stages 3 and 4 came in higher. Stages 6 and 5 and 6 were also much lower. In my survey, the Likert style survey, I actually broke down Kotter's thing into 15 different categories because I wanted to kind of observe whether or not, like in urgency, for example, did that somehow break down somewhere in the process? What broke down? So I broke urgency down, for example, to talk about, did you communicate opportunities and threats? Did you talk about how you handle conflict in the beginning? So in each stage, I added a different step to kind of see where maybe the churches might have struggled implementing Kotter in their congregation. So here we go. This is the results of the survey. And this will be kind of a running theme you'll hear over and over again, but this is the first one we ran across: opportunities. Authoritative leaders rated lowest on effectively communicating opportunities to their leadership compared to transformational, servant, and charismatic leaders. And here's an example of a change opportunity. Move from programs to discipleship as a DNA of the church, built a $2.5 million remodel. They moved to confirmation out of 8th grade to continuous confirmation. In addition, they started a mission training center to raise people out of mission childcare center and a men's discipleship group. That was what a transformational leader did with change opportunity. On this one, we talked about, look at the potential. Did the leaders lay out potential threats in the beginning of the change process? And in this survey, authoritative leaders rated lower than transformational, servant, and charismatic leaders at clearly communicating potential threats to the change process. Communicating urgency. This is how it was done as an example from some of the qualitative results. Identify pros and cons of situations, presented that in church. Same kind of a process used by authoritative leader as well. This one we tried in the same urgency stage, asking the question, did they create a culture of dialogue? In this particular graph, authoritative leaders rated lower at communicating or creating an opportunity for honest dialogue to take place in the change process. but transformational leaders did better job at doing that than authoritative leaders did. Stage 2 of Kotter is recruiting a diverse team. Again, authoritative leaders rated lower than transformational, servant, and charismatic leaders at creating a change coalition. We also added the question of, was the team diverse in its skills and gifts and abilities? When we asked that question, authoritative leaders also ranked lowest at creating a diverse coalition team compared to transformational and servant leaders. Recruiting a diverse team. This is an example of what that looks like for authoritative leaders. The governing body consists of experienced teachers, business leaders, scientists, and other professionals, as well as relatively new members and others who were long-term members who did a self-study together and began to call process. That's what that did. As opposed to authoritative leaders who had a much smaller, look like team led by pastoral staff and elders, and expertise consisted of those people who were elected by the church leadership. We asked the question how they can effectively communicate stage 4 of Kotter. Again, authoritative leaders rated lowest at communicating effectively to vision moving forward compared to transformational and charismatic leaders. Here's what it looked like for authoritative leader who did not do that well. It seemed to be lacking, the participant said, as opposed to a transformational leader who said several different ways at several different points, including not only weekend messages, town hall meetings, extended Q&A sessions, various supporting print and digital resources. They did podcasts, emails, etc. So they had a lot of ways of communicating the vision. We asked the question again at this stage 4 of were concerns handled when maybe things arose during the stage. So we asked that question, and authoritative leaders again rated lowest at taking the time to answer and handle concerns at this stage of the change process compared to transformational, servant, and charismatic leaders. Empowering change, where the structures is where we talk about the structures being changed and addressed. Authoritative leaders also rated lowest at evaluating organization structures and processes compared to transformational leaders. We also ask about removing barriers. At this stage, authoritative leaders rated lowest at removing barriers to change compared to all the other styles of leadership. And some examples of removing barriers from one of the things is the biggest challenge was to buy into having something more. It was not that they wanted to cling on to the old, but the challenges was to get them to embrace the new with a mindset toward action and participation. Stage 6, we asked about short-term wins. Again, authoritative leaders rated lowest of this compared to all the other styles of leadership. Some examples of short-term wins here: constant cheerleading by the pastor at Bible classes, meetings, etc. Short-term wins by sharing of stories. We asked that question, and authoritative leaders rated lowest at that compared to transformational and servant leaders and charismatic leaders. And then stage 7, we asked about the acceleration of did the staff implement the vision and how well they did that. Authoritative leaders rated lowest on that compared to servant leaders, transformational leaders, skill-based leaders, and charismatic leaders. And then we asked if that change happened with just the congregational elected leaders. And again, authoritative leaders rated lowest compared to transformational leaders in that area. And then the final change process is the change actually get implemented, and authoritative leaders rated lowest in that compared to transformational, servant, and charismatic leaders. So an example of some new ministries that were created from a change of a congregation was discovered and partnered classes to incorporate new members with clarity. Monthly leadership team meetings where mission and vision were evaluated. So the answer to the question, primary question 1 was, how do congregations implement and experience organizational change? Congregations that struggled did less preparatory work and focused more on implementation, while changing the organizational structure was completely absent from their process. Churches experienced resistance, but those who communicated the why and allowed for honest conversations throughout the process overcame that resistance. Churches tend not to be effective at quickly adapting to change. Empathy needs to be included in the process. We really tested for that with some of the questions and make sure that they give people a chance to give feedback during the process. Churches needed to address their local structures and policies, and storytelling of the vision and action is vital to embed the culture change in the organization. Sub question one was, what barriers do congregations face during the change process? The type of leadership style does not play a significant role in effective change except for authoritative leaders. Celebrating wins is not a normal part of a congregational life, but it's vital for buy-in. Communication progress was not consistent throughout the entire change process. Many failed to address barriers to change early and during the change process, those who did not do well at this. Lack of assessment of current organizational structures and processes that may be outdated, and failed to recruit a change coalition. What specific actions and behaviors do thriving congregations implement during the process? We looked at the Kotter model and see which one of those rated highest, and this is the order that it came in. So urgency was still number one, but number two was strategic vision, or define the trophy. Number three was the fourth process, communicate the process regularly. Identify, eliminate barriers came in fourth. Achieving the goals, which is number seven, came in five. Successful organization, create a diverse change coalition, was six. The final flourishing stage, where the actual change embedded in the culture, came in seventh. And the last one was short-term wins and sharing of stories in progress. What characteristics do successful congregations share that distinguish them from comparable ones that languishing? Again, it goes back to that leadership thing. Most did a good job except for authoritative leaders. Successful churches in creating urgency examine opportunities and threats in the beginning of that process and communicated that clearly. These churches clearly established strategic vision, or defined their trophy. They excelled at communicating the vision throughout the process. These churches kept momentum going and consolidated gains, and they embed the change into the organization's new culture. Implications. The church needs to be more intentional, strategic, and informed in their approach to organizational change. Kotter's model of organizational change applies to churches as well as businesses and other institutional bodies. As long as church leadership is not authoritative, every leadership style has approximately the same potential to be successful. And opportunity for future research, I think it needs to have more diverse people who are not just pastors in this survey to give a fuller picture of multiple perspectives. Collecting more data on skill-based leaders might add more depth to leadership style there as well. And I'd like to see in the future more denominations take part in this survey to see how change is applied versus polity and leadership management style. Conclusion, there is no organization with more lasting impact than the church. As society is becoming more secular, the challenge is to prepare the church for change with the right tools to make the greatest kingdom impact. And there we go.
Great job, Keith. This was really well done. Very, very well articulated. And we can tell there was a lot of work that went into every single part, all of these chapters, all 5 chapters. And your conclusions, you just wrapped it up so nicely. But I'm gonna offer the floor to the committee. Does the committee have any questions for Keith?
Kevin, go ahead and start.
Oh, thank you. Ready for this, Keith?
No, not really, but okay.
The former journalist gets to ask questions.
Right.
Yeah. You know, what's your confidence level in translating Kotter's steps to a language that those going through your survey could understand?
That's a good question. You know, I think for the church, the resistance often the church has is they don't like any model that sounds too businessy. And so I'm trying to use language that may be better suited for the church, that they'll be less resistant to. And that's why I changed it. Because I'm afraid whenever you bring in business models, church goes, it's not a business, we're a church. And so doing that a little bit, talking about producing fruit versus, you know, flourishing stages or whatever, may be more adaptable, acceptable for church leadership to hear.
Right. Do you think that your definition of missional is also a pretty close definition for apostolic, and seeing kind of the context Missouri Synod?
Well, it's funny that definition is a Missouri Synod definition. So,
Right.
but it's a 1969 definition. So it's probably in our church body changed since then. Um, it's pretty consistent with what the Bible says. So I think we have to reconnect with that definition. I think that's important for the church to realize that they really are connected to God, and that the church is God's arm of mission.
Yeah, you can find that definition clear back before World War II among Lutherans,
Right.
just back on the continent,
Right.
back in Europe. And so kind of carried forward. And that's the reason I ask about apostolic, is that I think it communicates to a broader range of with the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, Episcopalians, Roman Catholics, a lot of the folks who filled out your survey. But I'm not certain it's a perfect parallel, as you were saying. It's not
Right.
the same. Okay.
But it's new enough, I think, in our language today where it should not raise alarms, but it should get people thinking, reminding themselves that this is what God's mission is, and the church is connected to that mission of who God is.
Okay. I'll do a final one and hand off if anyone else wants to jump in. You know, you worked so hard at making sure you had the qualities you needed in your research. You had enough people answering the survey to start with and broke it down. So I'm curious as to why you only spoke with 2 pastors, 2 leaders in the verification step. Any thought of talking to more?
I thought about more, but then as I was getting information back from the online survey, there was I had more people take it than I thought I was going to have to take it, close to 250. That I thought this was and a lot of good qualitative research in there, that I don't know how much more people would have added to it than the 2 I did add. If I felt that it was still something missing, that they were saying something different than what the survey would, I would have expanded beyond the 2.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Dr. Doran, do you have a few questions?
Yes, I do. First of all, Keith, what a wonderful day for you, your family, your friends, as you've demonstrated so many skills in terms of your written and oral communication skills, your scholarly research, your critical thinking skills, all demonstrated today through your presentation, as well as your dissertation. And I'd like to share a few comments on each of your 5 chapters, interspersed with some questions for you to answer and to clarify, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Well, first off, let's start with chapter 1. I found your first opening paragraph to be extremely powerful and insightful, and it really drew my interest as a reader into your dissertation work. The actual numbers and percentages, while unfortunately demonstrated a decline in church attendance and closings, did support the need for you to conduct this research utilizing Kotter's steps effectively in religious nonprofit settings. So that's really, this is an important dissertation. You were clear, where your research questions were clear and appropriate, and they are empirically answerable, which you demonstrated in chapters 4 and 5. So well done there. Excellent discussion on Kotter's work in secular organization and its application or its adaptation in this study to church organizations is also well done. Good use, explanation, and comparison of Hilder's church change model to Kotter's steps of leading organizational change is also commendable. And finally, you provided a clear and concise summary that elicited interest and curiosity for the reader in closing out your chapter 1. Chapter 2, I don't have a whole lot of comments here because we've already kind of gone through that earlier through my notes that I gave to Dr. Kim earlier as you move forward with the dissertation process, but definitely demonstrates your robust understanding of other research on organizational change and leadership. It connects literature on organizational change and leadership to your hypotheses and sub-questions, and your summary is clear and concise. Moving to chapter 3, let's see. You do provide the rationale for the use of the explanatory sequential mixed methods design, and you provide that in a comprehensive and yet understandable way. Very well done there. Your understanding of the use and analysis of both quantitative and qualitative methods is clearly demonstrated, and I'll provide some examples of that in the form that we will fill out. You'll have some examples of those. So well done there as well. Your description of sampling procedures and the large sample size for quantitative data analysis was very good. And you've answered the question in terms of what, could you talk maybe a little bit more maybe about the process you used to reach the sample size of 380 participants? Was it a stratified random sample?
It was. And unfortunately, I could not break through to some denominations I wanted to. I really wanted more Methodists in this survey because of where what their church is going through in terms of the change processes happening in their church in real time. And I also wanted to get more input from Catholics. I was surprised that I could find enough large churches. I got like 8 mega churches in the survey, which was more than I was hoping for. So that was extremely helpful. So yeah, I reached out to a lot of connections I had in the church world, but I thought that 380 was good because that's about the number 380,000 churches we can list in the country, U.S. So that would have been a good sample size to get a good number for significant study.
Yes, and I would agree. Your 380 participants is well done for a dissertation of this level. Some other comments real quickly on chapter 3. You did a thorough description of your selection of the interviewees, the interview process, the instrumentation of the qualitative data analysis, and your ethical considerations are clearly articulated as well. Let's move to chapter 4. On page 90, you write significant differences in the impact of Kotter's theory of change process on non-church and church organizations. There are significant differences. Could you talk a little bit more about how those processes differ?
From church and non-church?
Yes.
So for church organizations, the way the process is differ for Kotter is you have to take into account the fact that you have volunteer staff in a church setting versus a business setting. You also have to understand that because this is a volunteer organization, you have to incorporate into your process more levels of input and empathy in that church setting, because you will lose members if you change too quickly. And I really want to get into the fact that for the church, especially members, every change is a loss to someone. So how do you empathetically do the change process in a church setting compared to a business setting? Does that answer your question?
Yes. Is there any other clarification from you that you would need, Dr. Kim or Dr. Wilson?
No.
All right. Well, then, okay, then I'll continue then. I found your presentation was excellently done and covered much of the main questions and your hypotheses and sub questions for the dissertation. But I found a few of your other statistically significant differences that I'd like you to maybe expand upon. So for an example, you write statistically significant difference in mean score between the genders on how they viewed the organization's opportunities before implementing the change. Based on that, on your research, why do you think this might be?
It seemed to me that women looked upon the change in that particular one more negatively than men did. And I don't know why that was, but it was just an interesting, significant level that women were much harder at rating the change. And maybe because we're denser than women are. Women seem to have more understanding of the emotions in the process. Men are more kind of we have to do this kind of a thing. And so I think the women just were more sensitive to the fact that more people were being impacted by the change than maybe men were aware of.
Thank you. Here's another interesting finding that you wrote about. Post hoc tests revealed a significant difference between LCMS and non-LCMS churches regarding how they create a strategic vision. In what ways do they go about creating a strategic vision differently? What's the differences between those who create a vision in the LCMS and that in the non-LCMS, at least within those who participated in your study?
It appeared as I looked at the study that the non-LCMS churches were better at strategy than LCMS churches were. And they were also better at communicating the reason for their vision. So they had a clearer vision, and they did a better job of communicating the vision than LCMS churches did. I think this is typically a new process for LCMS churches, most LCMS, and a lot of the churches that took the survey of LCMS were smaller. So the non LCMS churches were much larger. They were either mega churches or large churches. So size played a factor in this as well.
Thank you. And here's one more interesting finding from your study, and you write this. Post hoc tests revealed a significant difference between mega and medium-sized churches regarding how they create a strategic vision. The study also identified the larger churches proved more effective than smaller churches in creating a strategic vision for change. Based on that research you've conducted, why do you think this might be?
Because as you look at the large churches, you had staff, and I looked at the small churches who filled out the survey. Most of them was kind of the pastor and a volunteer group of people who were trying to carry this out. The large churches had more executive staff, more assistant pastor staff. They just had more trained, equipped staff to do this. So it didn't all fall on the pastor as leader to do this. That would appear to me to be the reason why they struggled more than small churches did. I mean, why small churches struggle more than large churches did.
Thank you. And here's a little more. I know it may be sounding like I'm grilling you a little bit, but I was
No, it's fine. I like the
I was
conversation.
fascinated by your dissertation, and there's a lot of, it's very comprehensive and a lot of detail. And I want to make sure that you have the opportunity to shine this afternoon with regard to all the great work that you did for this dissertation. Well, here's the last one in chapter 4 for you. Transformational, charismatic, and servant leaders rated higher at implementing strategic vision and mission than authoritative leaders, which you alluded to or you earlier presented. Authoritative leaders in particular had difficult time gaining momentum, leading the change in their organizations. You also write, when creating a culture where honest dialogue took place, non-LCMS congregations did a better job of that than LCMS ones. Non-LCMS congregations proved to be more effective in developing a strategic vision than LCMS churches, which you've discussed briefly earlier in your presentation. Although this question is not addressed in your study, do you think that an association between authoritative leaders and lack of honest dialogue exists in many LCMS congregations that may be a major contributor to the demise, if not closure, of some of those congregations?
I would say yes. And that's why I wanted to add that to every stage, every major stage of the process to find out, is the congregation taking the time to say, okay, urgency is here. Let's talk about this. Let's have Q&A sessions on it. We're talking about now the strategy and the vision. Let's have Q&A about the process. And then also reporting what are the results of the Q&A and the communication network. Because I think what happens as I've worked with churches myself personally is the communication drops off and the vision becomes something that sits on the shelf if it's not constantly communicated and shared throughout the process and constantly, it just goes away and people lose sight of it. So I wanted to make sure that the church, and I think the other part of it is that they don't really share stories in the LCMS very well. We don't talk about what God is doing in our churches. And by not doing that, we don't lift up how God is using us and the processes in our churches too. Non-LCMS tend to not worry about whether or not we talk about God and brag about what God's doing as much as LCMS churches do.
Thank you. I have two other housekeeping items for you that I won't go through at this time, but we can. I'll send that forward to Dr. Kim for you to work on chapter 4. Chapter 5 is another clearly written, cogent chapter to conclude your dissertation. You use quotes. Well, you use quotes from participants in the study and interconnect other research with that study, and I found that to be very exemplary in terms of your ability to do so. Recommendations by you were supported by the findings of the study and other research on organizational change and leadership. I found your conclusion to be insightful and powerful. And here's my last comment with a question. Transformational leaders rated, this is from what you write, transformational leaders rated more effective during the change process than any other leadership style. Authoritative leaders consistently struggled to move their congregation at each stage of Kotter's steps effectively. Yet the study also revealed that servant leaders fared only slightly better than authoritative leaders in leading change. Why do you think this is, and what leadership style or combination of styles do you see as best to promote organizational change in our churches?
Here's my assessment of, I think, the servant leaders struggle because servant leaders put people first. When the change begins to happen and there's resistance to the change, servant leaders may abdicate that growth to our people following and our people happy. Whereas transformational leaders empower those around them and invest in the organization, see the bigger goal as being the growth of the organization, not making people feel good about themselves. And I think that's why servant leaders may struggle a little bit more than transformational in some of the stages where it gets to the part where it gets really difficult in the pushback and the resistance in the change process.
Thank you. Final comment, you've provided us with an exemplary dissertation and presentation today. Thank you.
Thanks.
Dr. Doring, I just learned so much from you, just from the way that you take apart dissertations and provide effective and valuable feedback. The questions also were some of the things that have been percolating in my mind, and you've eloquently and appropriately asked them in ways that Keith was able to answer them. Dr. Wilson, I'm going to bring it back to you. Did you have any other follow-up questions before I ask a few of my own?
Just a couple.
Okay.
First is actually more of a challenge. Page 119 of your page 119, as you're explaining why you wanted to use to study Kotter's steps, you write that you chose it because his 8 steps are easy to implement. And I'm having trouble finding any nonprofit leader who has said to me, you know what? I chose it because it was easy to implement. It's easy to read. Yes, it's easy to read, but implement? So
Well,
talk more about it, because
we could have used
more
Lewin, which only
behind
had 3 steps.
Yeah. So what else is behind this? This make it implementable?
Well, to me, the process flows quite well, and it's very logical. And I think if you follow those steps with urgency, creating a diverse team, creating vision, you have a process where, first of all, you're not doing it alone. I think the most change in churches is where the leader's doing it by himself. Kotter really makes you get a team on board to walk alongside you and help communicate the vision. And those are going to be some key steps, whether or not this gets implemented. The short-term wins thing, if it's not just the pastor talking about short-term wins, but it's a team in that visioning process and communication process, it's easier than having one voice every single Sunday getting up and saying, this is going really well. It really is going really well. And so I think the way that's laid out is easier for an organization to implement because there are actionable steps that they can follow. That's what I meant. In terms of change itself, no change is easy.
I had not thought of that. So thank you. And now I'm going to start processing it, but I need to focus on our questions. You know, in your experience with the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, you've worked with a lot of pastors, right? A ton of pastors. What's the primary leadership style among clergy in your own denomination?
It's going to be, they would say they're servant leaders, but I don't know if that's actually what they are. I think servant leader has been the default leadership style because it sounds like what you should be as a pastor.
Okay.
But I don't know if that's actually true of most pastors. I mean, not all pastors. I don't think you're all servant leaders. But if you ask them, it's like, well, I'm a shepherd. And so shepherds serve. And so I think they just default to servant leadership as their style.
So what do you think's out there then? Or what are the top 2 most accurate descriptions of the leadership style?
You know, as I look back at this, I almost regret that I did not include transactional leadership in the survey,
Okay.
because I really thought authoritative leaders would probably address what we call the hair pastor type of pastor, who leads kind of with an iron fist and it's got to be my way. But I really figured it'd be less transactional because it just doesn't fit the ministry mold, and those guys probably don't last very long in our churches, because you can't do ministry transactionally. But I think that probably there are probably some more of those as well. But I think they're probably more transformational leaders than they would give themselves credit for.
Okay. Yeah, that also gets into seminary recruitment and other areas. Yeah, for your next project, looking forward to as you start to explain how the authoritative leader can become the transformational leader. But that's for the next project.
But
Okay.
you keep becoming a narcissistic leader.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Those are my questions.
Wonderful. Again, thank you both for your insightful questions. I feel like they've really contributed to both our collective understanding of Keith's research, but I think that a lot of these questions are useful for Keith to consider as he, just works on his final edits and build into sort of his final summaries and conclusions some of these pieces that some of you have brought up in this defense today. Keith, a lot of the questions I had on my mind have already been asked. I think one of the things I just want to follow up on in terms of what Dr. Wilson asked, in terms of what leadership styles do LCMS pastors embody. And I think that one thing, one aspect of leadership that I'm not sure is a centerpiece of the way that you've looked into leadership is leadership based on context and purpose, right? So when you're asking the question, what type of leadership do they employ? Perhaps, could there be a difference in how they lead when it comes to churches that are stable or churches that are experiencing growth or churches that are experiencing decline, or even leadership on Sundays, right? Pulpit leadership, as opposed to organizational administrative leadership, right? Are there different styles? So I'm hearing servant leadership, right? And I can see how I don't know very many churches where a pastor isn't a servant in terms of their approach to the congregations, right? Especially on Sundays.
Right.
But I know enough pastors to know that their staff probably wouldn't call them servant leaders, right?
Yeah, probably.
Right. And so again, maybe a context specific definition or classification of pastors as leadership types may be an appropriate way to envision how we describe pastors and leadership, right? So more of a comment and a little bit of a question there. The question that I had, though, in terms of the research that you presented, I think that from an outside observer, as you were delving into those graphs, right? You had graph after graph after graph. They were interspersed with some commentary and some quotes that were qualitative, but there were a lot of graphs that almost look identical, right? You've got authoritative being rated as the very lowest in every single one of those graphs. And you made sure to make that commentary at the end of each of those presentations is authoritative leaders were the weakest in every single category and every single stage. And then you had all the other leadership styles rising above it. And I really appreciated the care that you took to describe the post hoc results, that just because they look like they're different from authoritative leaders, that there was enough overlap between some of those leadership styles that you can't definitively say they were actually statistically different from one another. I appreciated that the care that you took to describe the ones that actually had a statistically significant difference from authoritative leaders, right? So sometimes you would say transformational and servant leaders had higher scores than authoritative, or sometimes you would say skill-based and transformational. I think in every situation, transformational leaders were always different from authoritative leaders, and it almost seemed like those were opposite poles of the spectrum, right?
Right.
But, and this is the question, this is where I'm going with the question. Almost universally, we saw, again, authoritative and transformational being very different in the results. The other three, there was a little bit of variation there based on the stage that you were looking at. I remember very specifically that for one of those questions, skill-based leadership was very low compared to the other three at the top.
Right.
I think it was like empowering the change, or it was some type of maybe communicating the vision or empowering the change. Step 4, step 5. I'm wondering, do you have any insight into that? Why in that particular stage, you might want to, you can bring it up as you might want to share the screen again and show us
Okay.
if you can do that. Why do you, according to the things that you found out, why for that particular graph and that particular stage, was there this unexpectedly low result for skill-based? And then across the board, yeah, keep going up a little bit. I think it was stage 4 or stage 5. Keep going up. Yeah, keep going, keep going. So it was, no, keep going. Skill-based was significant. It might have been this one, but yeah, it might have been this one. Can you go up maybe 1 or 2 more just to check?
Or is it this one?
Yeah. You see how this one and the one after it, right? Skill-based is significantly lower than all of the other ones. And I'm wondering, do you have any insight into that? Why? Let's just focus on this, right? Why
Sure.
skill-based leadership performed so poorly on number 1, communicating vision, and then the next one, which was, can you go down 2 slides? Yeah, no, you were there. No,
This
no,
one? Oh,
no,
this
you were
one?
there before. No, go back up. It was just 2 slides down.
Oh,
Yeah, so go slow 2 slides down. Yeah, this one. So this was a little bit lower too, right? So how concerns during change were handled by leadership? Why in both of these scenarios were skill-based leadership so unexpectedly low compared to the other 3 that were traditionally higher or consistently higher?
I would say that because skill-based really deals with kind of the technical parts of leadership. I wonder if the parts about the vision that are more emotional, they struggled with. And so this one about communicating vision, like big picture thinking, they struggle more with that, as well as the how do you handle concerns? Again, this is the emotional part of the change process.
Okay.
How are you dealing with the fact
Yeah.
that people are maybe not handling this well, versus you can
Yeah.
technically just to do setting a to cast leading people with a strategic vision. You can handle dealing with the organization structures and processes. Those are all technical things. These are more, are you dealing with people one-on-one emotionally?
So would you be willing to say that skill-based is very narrowly defined as technical or hard skills based versus soft skills?
I would say it's very hard skill based.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense then. The way you described it and how you defined it makes a lot of sense. Now, my follow-up question though is this. In your conclusions, you say it doesn't really matter what style of leadership you have, right? In terms of change process,
Well,
unless you're authoritative.
unless you're authoritative, right?
Why do you think that is? Why do they hang together? Charismatic, servant, skill-based, and transformational throughout. They seem to move together, except for those few exceptions. They seem to move together. Why do what leads to that finding? What based on your understanding?
So if you look at the definition we used in the survey, rapid change, decisive, brings clarity, chain of command, very goal focused and powerful. That process is going to be really focused on, we got to get to the next step, got to get to the next step. And I think in the church, without taking into account the emotional impact that change has on people, that style will come across being very insensitive.
Okay.
The skill base values accomplishments. When you get to the point where all of a sudden now you're not, it's more emotional and you can't quantitatively measure how someone's feeling, you're going to struggle probably with those areas as well in the skill-based part.
Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah, I'm wondering if whenever you see constructs that travel together in multiple results, oftentimes it's an indication that there needs to be a reclarification of those categories, and perhaps those categories aren't that different. That maybe a servant leader and a transformation leader share a lot of common characteristics, and maybe even could be combined as a single broader category. A lot of times, if they're consistently hanging together in the results, it's an indication that they're a single construct and not multiple constructs. So I'm wondering, do you think that there is room for there to be a consolidation of some of these leadership styles?
I don't know if I would combine servant and transformational.
Okay.
I do think where people may see some connection. Authoritative and skill-based, or see, that's why I was worried about transactional. I think transactional is awfully close to authoritative. And I think that would have really that would have really skewed it. That's why I went more with skill-based.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think people in their minds may think servant and transformational are similar.
Yeah.
Well, the definitions are different enough where I think you wouldn't put them together. Now, a couple people in the survey said they're a mixture of all, which yeah, I get people who that maybe having a combination of having a category of there's a mixture of several ones that might have helped alleviate some of that
Yeah.
as a possibility.
Yeah. Again, so I mean, I understand that these are founded in theoretical constructs. These are founded on theoretical premises. And so these definitions really do try to separate them out. But what I was going for in terms of my question was when you're seeing results where you've got like things that you've categorized as different people, but they're always showing the same results together. It's usually an indication in research. It's usually an indication that the definitions might be merging into one another, that they aren't actually that different from one another.
Right.
In relationship to change. Yeah, in relationship to change. So again, if you were to do the research over, maybe choosing fewer categories, right? But broadening those categories a little bit. So sometimes what the literature shows is a spectrum. So they show a very sort of on one end of the spectrum, they, like you said, transactional, transformational. That's a very common scale, right? Like if you had a scale of 1 through 5 or 1 through 100, on one end, it would be transactional. On the other end, it would be transformational. And then you have, the spaces in between because it's a spectrum, right?
Right.
And so a lot of times it's easier to look at fewer categories because you don't have the problem of overlap. In your case, you specifically wanted to look at these different leadership styles. But again, the results are showing that maybe there is so much overlap that you can collapse some of if you were to do the research over again, that maybe some of these categories could be collapsed and they could be merged so that it simplifies it for the respondent and they're not having to juggle, oh, they're a little bit of this and a little bit of that. It would make it a little clearer for them. And it could be a scale of 1 through 100. How transformational are they? Or how transactional they are. So that'll give you a scale of leadership as opposed to they're exactly this, which is really hard. Most leaders aren't exactly one thing. They're usually a combination of things, or they're usually on a scale of difference. So
yeah, I'm partially narcissistic and transformational. So
well, wonderful. That's all the questions I had, Keith. This is a phenomenal work that you did. I think, again, the last comment I want to make is there's such a paucity of research in this area in relationship to organizational change and churches, particularly using some of these business models as an interpretive lens, not as a practical implementation, but as an evaluative lens to look at how churches move through change. There is, and you showed this in the literature review, there are a few studies, some of them are like 20 years old now, and there aren't a lot. They're far and few between. Your work contributes so much to this field. It's so complex, so nuanced. I think that there is a lot more to be said about this topic, and I think that you have the platform to do this now. So, Keith, I encourage you to get the word out there. Share this with as many, constituents that are in your network, but go beyond. Look for other platforms to share this, because I think this applies not only to the Lutheran Church, it applies to churches in general. So, great work.
Dr. Kim, can I jump in?
Sure.
To dovetail. I did some research into other dissertations looking for those that worked with Kotter, and it was amazing. No one focused on Kotter. I found several that were, not even several, 6. That, okay, Carter's part of one chapter in one place.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm like, wow, Keith's onto something here. Let's go.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, Keith, at this time, I'm going to excuse you from the room. I will text you when we're ready for you, and the committee, if you can stay on, will deliberate
All right.
together.
Thanks.
Great job, Keith. All right. So overall, gentlemen, what'd you think? Oh, let me stop the recording, by the way.
Yeah.